Hi Scarlett, here's some more for you. So I think we're on chapter 8, the brown hen. Here we go. Bit of water first. George stood in the farmyard looking up at the roof. The old farmhouse had a fine roof of pale red tiles and tall chimneys. There was no sign of Grandma. There was only a song thrush sitting in one of the chimney pots singing a song. The old wurzels got stuck in the attic, George thought. Thank goodness for that. Suddenly, a tile came clattering down from the roof and fell into the yard. The song thrush took off fast and flew away. Then another tile came down, then half a dozen more, and then very slowly, like some weird monster, rising up from the deep, Grandma's head came through the roof. Then her scrawny neck and the tops of her shoulders. "How am I doing, boy?" she shouted. "How's that for a bash-up?" "Don't you think you'd better stop now, Grandma?" George called out. "I have stopped," she answered. "I feel terrific. Didn't I tell you I'd magic powers? Didn't I warn you I'd wizardry in the tips of my fingers? But you wouldn't listen to me, would you? You wouldn't listen to your old Grandma." You didn't do it, Grandma," George shouted back to her. "I did it. I made you new medicine." "A new medicine? You? What rubbish!" she yelled. I did, George shouted. "You're lying as usual," Grandma yelled. "You're always lying." "I'm not lying, Grandma. I swear I'm not." The wrinkled old face high up on the roof stared unsuspiciously at George. "Are you telling me you actually made a new medicine all by yourself?" she shouted. "Yes, Grandma, all by myself." "Don't believe ya," she answered. "But I'm very comfortable up here. Fetch me a cup of tea." A brown hen was pecking about in the yard close to where George was standing. The hen gave him an idea. Quickly he uncorked the medicine bottle and poured some of the brown stuff into the spoon. "Watch this, Grandma," he shouted. He crouched down, holding out the spoon to the hen. "Chicken," he said. "Chick, chick, chicken. Come here, have some of this." Chickens are stupid birds and very greedy. They think everything is food. This one thought the spoon was full of corn. It hopped over. Pop, pop. It put its head on one side and looked at the spoon. "Come on, chicken," George said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." "Bark! Bark, 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 bark." The brown hen stretched out its neck towards the spoon, bark, and went peck. It got a beak full of medicine. The effect was electric. "Owie!" shrieked the hen, and it shot straight up into the air like a rocket. It went as high as the house. Then down it came again into the yard, splush! And there it sat with its feathers all sticking straight out from its body. There was a look of amazement on its silly face. George stood watching it. Grandma up on the roof was watching it too. The hen got to its feet. It was rather shaky. It was making funny gurgling noises in its throat. Its beak was opening and shutting. It seemed like a pretty sick hen. "You've done it in, you stupid boy," Grandma shouted. "That hen's going to die. Your father will be after you now. He'll give you socks and serve you right." All of a sudden, black smoke started pouring out of the hen's beak. "It's on fire!" Grandma yelled. "The hen's on fire!" George ran to the water trough to get a bucket of water. "That hen will be roasted and ready for eating any minute," Grandma shouted. George sloshed the bucket of water over the hen. There was a sizzling sound, and the smoke went away. "Old hen's laid its last eggs," Grandma shouted. "Hens don't do any laying after they've been on fire." Now that the fire was out, the hen seemed better. It stood up properly. It flapped its wings. Then it crouched down low to the ground as though getting ready to jump. It did jump. It jumped high into the air and turned a complete somersault and then landed back on its feet. "It's a circus!" a sen, Grandma shouted from the rooftop. It's a flippin' acrobat. Now the hen began to grow. George had been waiting for this to happen. It's growing, he yelled. It's growing, Grandma. Look, it's growing. Bigger and bigger, taller and taller it grew. Soon the hen was 4 or 5 times its normal size. Can you see it, Grandma? George shouted. I can see it, boy, the old girl shouted back. I'm watching it. George was hopping about from one foot to the other with excitement, pointing at the enormous hen and shouting, It's had the magic medicine, Grandma, and it's growing just like you did. But there was a difference between the way the hen was growing and the way Grandma grew. When Grandma grew taller and taller, she got thinner and thinner. The hen didn't. It stayed nice and plump all along. Soon it was taller than George, but it didn't stop there. It went right on growing until it was about as big as a horse. Then it stopped. Doesn't it look marvellous, Grandma? George shouted. It's not as tall as me, Grandma sang out. Compared with me, that hen is ditchy small. I am the tallest of them all. Next chapter. The pig, the bullocks, the sheep, the pony and the nanny goat. At that moment, George's mother came back from shopping in the village. She drove her car into the yard and got out. She was carrying a bottle of milk in one hand and a bag of groceries in the other. The first thing she saw was the gigantic brown hen towering over little George. She dropped the bottle of milk. Crash! Splash! Then Grandma started shouting at her from the rooftop, and when she looked up and saw Grandma's head sticking up through the tiles, she dropped the bag of groceries. How about that then, eh, Mary? Grandma shouted. I'll bet you've never seen an hen as big as that. That's George's giant hen, that is. But, stammered George's mother. It's George's magic medicine, Grandma shouted. We've both of us had it, the hen and I. But how in the world did you get up on the roof? Cried Mother. I didn't, cackled the old woman. My feet are still standing on the floor in the living room. This was too much for George's mother to understand. She just goggled and gaped. She looked as though she was going to faint. A second later, George's father appeared. His name was Mr. Killicranky. Mr. Cranky was a small man with bandy legs and a huge head. There you go. He was a kind father to George, but he was not an easy person to live with because even the smallest things got him all worked up and excited. The hen standing in the yard was certainly not a small thing, and when Mr. Cranky saw it, he started jumping about as though something was burning his feet. Great heavens, he cried, waving his arms. What's this? What's happened? Where'd it come from? It's a giant hen. Who did it? I did, George said. Look at me, Grandma shouted from the rooftop. Never mind about the hen. What about me? Mr. Cranky looked up and saw Grandma. Shut up, Grandma, he said. It didn't seem to surprise him that the old girl was sticking up through the roof. It was the hen that excited him. He'd never seen anything like it. But then, who had? It's fantastic, Mr. Cranky shouted, dancing round and round. It's colossal. It's gigantic. It's tremendous. It's a miracle. How'd you do it, George? George started telling his father about the magic medicine. While he was doing this, the big brown hen sat down in the middle of the yard and went, Everyone stared at it. When it stood up again, there was a brown egg lying there. The egg was the size of a football. That egg would make scrambled eggs for 20 people, Mrs. Cranky said. George, Mr. Cranky shouted, how much of this medicine have you got? Lots, George said. There's a big saucepan full in the kitchen, and this bottle here is nearly full. "Come with me," Mr. Cranky yelled, grabbing George by the arm. "Bring the medicine. For years and years I've been trying to breed bigger and bigger animals. Bigger bulls for beef, bigger pigs for pork, bigger sheep for mutton." They went to the pigsty first. George gave a spoonful of medicine to the pig. The pig blew smoke from its nose and jumped about all over the place. Then it grew and grew. In the end, it looked like this. Wow. They went to the herd of fine black bullocks that Mr. Cranky was trying to fatten for the market. George gave each of them some medicine, and this is what happened. Look how big they are. Then the sheep. Ginormo sheep. Huge. He gave some to his grey pony, Jack Frost. And finally, just for fun, he gave some to Alma, the nanny goat. Look at that! Huge! A crane for Grandma. Grandma from high up on the rooftop couldn't see everything that was going on, and she didn't like what she saw. She wanted to be the centre of attention, and nobody was taking the slightest notice of her. George and Mr. Cranky were running round and getting excited about the enormous animals. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone on the rooftop. "Hey, you!" she yelled. "George, give me a cup of tea this minute, you idle little beast." "Don't listen to the old goat," Mr. Cranky said. "She's stuck where she is, and a good thing too." "But we can't leave her up there, Dad," George said. "What if it rains?" "George!" Grandma yelled. "Oh, you horrible little boy! You disgusting little worm! Fetch me a cup of tea at once and a slice of currant cake." "We'll have to get her out, Dad," George said. "She won't give us any peace if we don't." Mrs. Cranky came outside and she agreed with George. "She's my own mother," she said. "She's a pain in the neck," Mr. Cranky said. "I don't care," Mrs. Cranky said. "I'm not leaving my own mother sticking up through the roof for the rest of her life." So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company and asked them to send their biggest crane out to the house at once. There you can see. The crane arrived 1 hour later. It was on wheels and there were 2 men inside it. The craneman climbed up onto the roof and put ropes under Grandma's arms. Then she was lifted right up through the roof. In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. Had not made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered, but it seemed to have cured all her aches and pains, and she was suddenly as frisky as a ferret. As soon as the crane had lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack Frost, and jumped onto his back. Gallop! This ancient old hag, who was now as tall as a house, then galloped about the farm on the gigantic pony, jumping over trees and sheds and shouting, "Out my way! Clear the deck! Stand back, all you miserable midgets, or I'll trample you to death!" and other silly things like that. But because Grandma was now much too tall to get back into the house, she had to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats.